My name's Avery, and I'm going to be talking today a little bit about game mechanics as a type of political expression and as a site of queer possibility. So hopefully you're all excited for that. I wanted to start by introducing myself a little bit, situating myself in my work, just to give you some context before we truly dive in. So I've been designing games since 2005, self-publishing since 2006, and I'm going to talk about a couple of the games that I have created across that span. A lot of my games explore identity, self-doubt, relationship, and community, and often utilize supernatural elements or the collapse of civilization as a vehicle for kind of digging into those ideas in new ways. So out of the four pieces of work that I'm going to talk about just briefly to introduce you to me, the first I wanted to mention was The Quiet Year. The Quiet Year is atypical for role-playing games in that you don't play as a single specific character, you don't play scenes or narrate character dialogue. Instead, what you do is you collectively play as an entire community seen from kind of a bird's eye lens, and you explore how this community makes decisions and hopefully works together effectively to make use of 1 year of relative peace after the collapse of civilization. So this is a community that is isolated, that is dealing with scarcity, but that also has the potential to build something really beautiful. It's quite a procedural game, almost board game-like. And in this game, players take turns playing through a week at a time. Each week is a turn. It uses a deck of playing cards, and as there are 52 cards and 4 suits, there are 52 weeks and 4 seasons. And so it kind of utilizes the playing card deck structure to play through a year, introducing interesting dilemmas and twists and seeing how people prioritize their time. Dream Askew is another game about the collapse of civilization, but in this one you do play as characters and discuss what those characters think and say and do, like almost every role-playing game ever made. In Dream Askew, you play as members of a queer community that has fallen off the edges of a crumbling civilization. So you're in the rubble. It's just you and your exes in way too close of proximity, and you are trying to figure out how you work together, how you navigate relationships, how you make sense of imbalanced and awkward sources of power within community. I'm kind of nervous. You might hear it in my voice. I'm hoping that I just become less nervous as I keep talking. You're all a really lovely, thank you. You're all a really lovely audience so far. This is great. Monster Hearts is the third game that I wanted to mention. Monster Hearts is a game about the messy, secret lives of teenagers who are secretly monsters. And it explores this monstrosity as both a figurative and literal thing. So if your character is the werewolf, on that figurative level, it's, we're saying that they're possessive, territorial. They often reach for physical confrontation as a way to work through the complexities of their interiority. But also, they're literally going to turn into a hulking wolf under the light of the full moon and rip people limb from limb. And when you play the game, you kind of explore monstrosity on that slider of in any moment. We're not sure how much this is a metaphor for the complexities of being queer and young and navigating the terror and confusion of puberty, or, like being a monster. So that's Monster Hearts. And then the fourth that I wanted to mention isn't actually a single game, but rather an anthology of 4 short games. So Variations on Your Body is a collection of 4 solo, pervasive role-playing games. So rather than being games that you play with a group of friends around a table, they're kind of imagination exercises that you layer into your everyday life. So as you go about your day-to-day activities, as you go to work, as you ride the bus, you are imagining that you are, for example, a sparrow trapped inside of a human body, and that you need to scout for feathers, rebuild your wings, and eventually relearn how to fly. Or you're a necromancer who brought your bones back to life, and that's the way of navigating the complexities of depression. And so Variations on Your Body It's for, like, I would barely call them games. They're more like imagination exercises. But I think they kind of round out a reflection of the kinds of work that I've done in the past. So I mentioned that I first started designing games in 2005, and I have been designing ever since, which has given me a lot of time to look at role-playing games as a medium and ask, why this? Like, why am I not writing poetry or novels or screenplays? Why did I not join an improv troupe or a amateur theater company? Why didn't I take up sculpture or dance or any number of other ways that I could have expressed myself creatively? And I think there's a couple answers, but the one that I wanted to talk about today is that role-playing games, I think, are really beautifully and uniquely positioned to explore how things work and how people make choices with the resources that are put in front of them. So I wrote here that game design is structural storytelling. Novels are really good at exploring the interiority of a character. Movies are really good at exploring the sequence of action over time. Role-playing games are really good at exploring why people make choices and how those choices work and how the cause and effect kind of leads out from those choices. So before a group of people ever sits down at the table to stat up their characters and roll their dice, there's already a story being told within the pages of the game text. And that's a story about how certain things work. And that's what's really compelling to me as a game designer. So one of the things that game design does is it exposes the hidden rules of our world. And whether we're talking about a role-playing game that is set in our world here and now, or a time long, long ago, a galaxy far, far away, whatever the case might be, we're ultimately still making assertions about how we think the world works, how we think power works, how we think cause and effect work, causality and effectiveness. We're making assertions about what it's important to pay attention to in a moment of action or in a relationship. We're giving some things mechanical weight and other things we are ignoring. So game design exposes the hidden rules of our world, and then we get to turn those games over to players, and they get to experiment with those rules. They get to mess around and find out what happens. They get to make chaotic, weird, zany choices within a safe container and explore what happens when they make those choices in a way that they don't really get to safely within their everyday life. I have here a quote that I really like from feminist sci-fi and fantasy author Ursula K. Le Guin, and she wrote, "Fantasy not only asks, what if things didn't go on just as they do, but demonstrates what they might be like if they went otherwise." And so the thing that I really like about role-playing game design is that you get to make assertions and explore how things go on, what going on means. So games are made up of mechanics. Mechanics are assertions about how power works, about how cause and effect works, how causality works, how effectiveness works, and how change happens. Game mechanics are assertions about how people find themselves in the situations that they're in and how they can change the material circumstances around them with the access to power and resources that they have at their disposal. Those are all political statements. And I don't necessarily mean that in terms of the politics of left-wing and right-wing state, but rather politics in terms of statements about how power relations operate within contexts and between groups of people. Game mechanics are political expressions because they engage with those ideas: power, cause and effect, causality, effectiveness, and change. And if that's the case, I think it's really important to ask, what are the politics that we see operating within the games that we play? So I wanted to talk through a couple political assertions we see embedded within a lot of games, especially a lot of traditional fantasy adventure games. I say this not to attack any traditional fantasy adventure games. I love stories about elven warriors doing backflips and all that kind of stuff too. But these are some of the things that are kind of tacitly expressed through common game mechanics. The first is that power is earned, and it is the legitimate reward of righteous conquest. The power, that an individual's ability to overcome challenges is mostly earned through experience, right? We have experience points, you get enough experience points, you level up, you get cool powers, we're all familiar. There's this idea baked into that power is earned, and that if you are powerful, it is because you have gone out and you've lifted yourself up by your bootstraps, and that the innate increases in strength, you have the cool magical items that you acquired. There's this idea that that's all earned, fair, legitimate, and self-justifying. These are ideas that if you were to sit down and try to play, for example, Dungeons and Dragons, and say, I believe that power is a relational agreement between the ruled and the ruler, Dungeons and Dragons does not support you in telling that story. Dungeons and Dragons supports you in telling this story. It supports you in telling a story in which power is considered to be private, portable, and contextless, right? So there's this idea in a game like Dungeons and Dragons that I can kill some monsters over here, become powerful, and then travel somewhere far, far away and just take that power with me. That it's innate to me because I earned it, I own it, I don't need to share it with anybody, and it isn't contingent upon anybody else. The power is just something in me, and in the sword that I carry, and in whatever I've got, on me at the time. There's this idea that power is private, portable, and exists without context. This is an idea that I feel like a lot of queer people might be skeptical of, because we have a lot of lived experience with being very powerful, capable, alive within safe community spaces, and being very disempowered or disenfranchised or unsafe elsewhere, right? We know that power exists within context, and it is held amongst community very frequently in our lives. So this is telling somebody's story, but not necessarily mine, and not necessarily the story of everybody in this room. Finally, we have this idea that visible, heroic confrontation is what saves the day. That if there's a community under the iron rule of the terrible, evil Lich Lord and his undead legions, that the way that hold will be loosened will not be through mutual aid. It will not be through healing that occurs intergenerationally. It will not be through the seeds of wisdom planted by a grandmother in her grandchild's ear. It will be through a small number of very powerful, very self-possessed individuals going out and taking physical, concrete action, usually fighting, usually murder. That is how you overcome oppression within the context, framework, and rules of D&D. One could try to tell a different story. One could tell a story in which they seduce the evil Lich Lord. They become his betrothed. Across the course of 15, 16, 17 years, they slowly poison him against his own aims. But D&D isn't going to give them any support in telling that story. D&D is going to fight them at every turn to try and get them to tell this other story, the story where they kill a number of smaller, more minor villains in order to get power, and then take that power, which is legitimate, righteously earned, private, portable, and contextless, and then go and confront him and kill him. And that's a fun story. No one's mad at that story existing, but that story is built upon a bunch of biases and political assertions, And those are baked into the mechanics of the game. And in order to play that game, you need to, at least tacitly, at least temporarily, agree to uphold those assertions. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting the system at every turn, and you're going to be engaging with it pretty incoherently. I'm seeing some nods. Does that resonate? That's so many nods. Okay, so I talked a little bit about how game mechanics are political. I also wanted to talk about the idea that queerness is also political. And I think there's a couple of reasons that this is true. The first is that queer identities and relationships often exist outside of and sometimes in contradiction to a dominant social order. I think queerness is political because homophobes, transphobes, and bigots make it political, right? That our housing, our job security, the legitimacy of our relationships, our ability to go into the hospital room where our loved one is dying, those things have been made political by those who seek to erase us. And so it's political for a number of reasons. If game mechanics are political and queerness is political, then as a queer game designer, I really owe it to myself and to others to ask, how am I representing queerness within my games? Where does queerness live? Where does queerness not yet live? And I think it's important to kind of recognize that all game designers have a similar, there could be a similar call to action for all game designers to ask themselves, where does this human diversity that exists in the real world exist in my game? And if it doesn't exist in my game, why did I make that political choice? The same is true of questions of where does racial diversity exist within my game? Where do communities of color exist within my game? Where do indigenous perspectives exist within my game? Where is ability and disability troubled and challenged and introduced into my game? I don't feel qualified to speak to those questions, so we're sticking with this one. So queer representation really matters. Having art that features queer people, having world building and story that features queer people, introducing queer heroes that people can relate to, queer villains that people can defeat, whatever the case might be. Representation matters because when we see ourselves existing in this world, it affirms our right to exist not only in this world, this fantasy world, but also in our real world. And that's a right that is often challenged. So it's important. Representation matters. At the same time, representation is not enough. It is not enough to only ask that queer people exist in the art and in the fluff of games. Because that's not actually the stuff, when you get down to it, the role-playing games are built out of. Role-playing games are built out of systems. They're built out of rules. They're built out of game mechanics. All of the art, or all of the world building, that stuff, it's built out of that too. But what separates a role-playing game from a comic book, when you open it up and you flip through it, is that role-playing games have rules. So we have to ask, well, are the rules queer? Are the rules gay? Which is a complicated question. Because how would you deduce that? So we're going to engage with a little bit of queer theory here. We're going to engage with the practice of queering. I'm going to give you the shortest ever crash course in what queering and queer theory is. Queering interrogates normative structures. It looks at our pre-existing notions of how things are, and it says, well, that's how things are for some. What about the others? I just saved you like a master's degree. So where is the queer possibility in game mechanics? How might we move towards games as a site of queer possibility through the structures and processes of our game rules? I've identified 5 sites of possibility in that regard. I'm going to talk through why I think these are sites of queer possibility, and I'm going to talk about 1 or 2 games that I think explore it in a really interesting way. First, I'm going to have a drink of water. All right, here we go. Fluidity and transition, roles and reversals, erasure, embracing absurdity, and fluid character ownership. We're going to start at the beginning with fluidity and transition. Queer lives are rarely about a linear progression of power and accumulation, as is the one reflected in a traditional fantasy game like Dungeons and Dragons, or as is reflected in most stories about straight people. Queer lives are more frequently characterized by fluidity, transition, moments of rupture, and rebuild. And so it's important to have games that explore that mechanically. Has anyone here played Dialect? Amazing. Dialect is a phenomenal game about a language community and how a language dies. It is played in 3 eras, and in each of these eras, you construct words or idioms that are part of this language. And you play out short scenes where we get to see the language in use, or hear the language in use. Sometimes you're playing as a settler colony on Mars. Sometimes you're playing as kind of Cockney street gangs in a bygone era in London. Sometimes you're playing in strange magical settings, science fiction settings. Sometimes it's just a quirky little community here and now. But what's interesting about Dialect is that we get to explore what a language is like when it's thriving, what a language is like when the material structures of its community come under threat, and what a language is like as it's eroding and changing, and potentially its community is fracturing or is on the risk, or is in the risk of elimination. And so it's really interesting for a number of reasons. One, I think games that work towards inevitability at their end are just, I love them. I think they're really fascinating. But also because we get to see change, and it's not change in that visible heroic action way. It's change in a it is what it is. Communities change. You can never go home again kind of way. The next site of queer possibility that I identified was roles and reversals. Queer people exist outside of a lot of the roles that govern social behavior in our society. And so there's a lot of work that happens in queer community to either reclaim, recontextualize, challenge, move beyond, exist outside of, exist strangely within roles. And in addition to figuring out how to create our own roles or find ways to adapt roles to work for us, we also have a glorious tradition of subverting roles and challenging our ideas about how things have to be in relations between lovers or between community members or just between people. And so a game that explores roles and reversals in a really beautiful way is Alex Roberts' game Star-Crossed. Has anyone here played Star-Crossed? Okay, it's wonderful. More of you should check it out. It's a really simple and accessible game for 2 players, and there aren't a lot of role-playing games for 2 players, which is wonderful. It's the second game that I know of that was designed using a Jenga tower for its core resolution. There's Jenga, I suppose. Credit where due. And then there's Dread, which is a horror game. And then there's Star-Crossed, which is a game about a love that you really, really, really want to get to explore and really, really, really know that you shouldn't. The tensions in a story like that happen to be identical to those in a horror story, which is why Dread and Star-Crossed can use the same resolution mechanic, and it somehow works perfectly for both. But in Star-Crossed, you have a lead and a follow. One of those roles can at any time express how they feel. But in terms of taking action, they can only do that under specific rare circumstances. The other role can always act boldly, decisively, confidently, whenever and however they want. But in terms of actually naming their feelings, they can only do that under rare, specific scenarios. And so you have this, it's a little bit like a top-bottom kind of role, but it's also doing something different. You have someone who can act and someone who can feel. And the story is interesting not just because you get to play with those dynamics, but because there are those rare moments where you get to subvert them and see what happens when these people get to express themselves more holistically outside of, in addition to, within those roles. The third site for queer possibility within game mechanics is erasure. Frequently, queer people's stories are actively censored, or they're driven down, or queer people do not live long enough to get to tell their stories authentically and to the end. And so erasure is a common theme that we have to navigate. Queer people often have to try to find ourselves hiding in history because we weren't able to live openly. So together we write Private Cathedrals. It's a beautiful little two-player epistolary game, so a letter-writing game, about two people who history will remember as very good friends. It's about a love that you know that most of the time you are not safe to name openly. And so it's about the letters that you write to one another, and the mechanic that specifically speaks to that erasure is that you roll dice, I believe it's rolling dice, at the beginning to determine how openly you're able to talk about your love. Sometimes you're like, I trust that this is a safe space, that this letter will not fall into the wrong hands, and I can just say it. All those things that I've been waiting my whole life to say to somebody. Other times you're like, I can probably speak in innuendos and coy references. And other times you will write the letter and then tear it to pieces or burn it, and it will not make its way to your beloved. Has anyone here played Together We Write Private Cathedrals? It's so good, and it's really worth checking out. And it explores erasure mechanically, including actually erasing or destroying in some way the letters that you write. Queer people are often told that our lives, identities, relationships, and interests are ridiculous or impossible. And one of the ways that you challenge that is by, as in Together We Write Private Cathedrals, exploring that kind of erasure, that stamping out. The other way, though, is that you careen into really weird territory and you embrace absurdity and you say, cool, we're impossible. We're magical otherworldly creatures. If you're telling us we can't exist within the rules of this world, then we'll explore what it means to exist within the rules of a different one. And so embracing absurdity is another way to work towards queer possibility. There's two games I want to talk about here. The first is Lichcraft. Just because I like getting people to raise their hands, apparently. Who here has played or read Lichcraft? Like 2 or 3 people. Fantastic. So Lichcraft is a game about how you are trans. You are on the waiting list to access gender-affirming healthcare in England. So you are on the National Health Services waiting list. As everyone knows, it is a very, very, very long waiting list. In fact, at the time that you start the game, it is 300 years long. So what you need to do is you need to gather magical components, construct a magical ritual, and carry out the ritual in order to become an immortal lich, so that you have a shot of getting that surgery. It's quite fun. Brave Sparrow is a game that that I wrote about. I want to talk about it after I get another sip of water. So Brave Sparrow is one of the 4 games in that anthology I mentioned, Variations on Your Body. It's actually the first one of the 4 that I created. And you were not supposed to talk about Brave Sparrow with those who are not part of the Sparrow Underground. I've got a good vibe from you all. I'm going to take a leap of faith and assume that you're all there with me and tell you about it. So in Brave Sparrow, you realize that all along, that thing that you've been feeling, how you don't fit right in your body, how you're just built different somehow. You don't belong amongst people. It's because you're not people. You're a sparrow. And that's really difficult to accept at first because you don't look anything like a sparrow. There's a complicated reason why you're in a human body. But regardless of that reason, you know that what you need to do is that you need to regrow your wings, reclaim sparrowhood, and return to the sky. And so you play this game in your daily life. And the way you play it is mostly as you go about your day, looking for feathers. And you can have up to 3 feathers at a time. There's some rules around collecting them. Anyone who's an ornithologist knows that collecting stray feathers is actually a crime, and I didn't know that when I wrote the game. But you go throughout your daily life, witness moments of quiet beauty, act with bravery, and collect feathers. And once you have 3 feathers, you're ready for a sparrow mission. And these sparrow missions culminate in a moment where you get to hold the feathers to your arm, believe against all rational thought that these might be your feathers, and hopefully some of them stick, refuse to your bones, and with enough time and enough sincere belief, you'll do the impossible, you'll regrow your wings, and you will be able to fly again. It's a game that only is worth playing if you're going to suspend belief, at least on some level, and try believing this. I wrote this game before I realized I was trans. And embracing the absurdity of this game and trying to sincerely play it, even though I knew that that couldn't possibly be true, was how I came to realize that sometimes impossible things can be realer than anything we've known before. Realize I'm trans. The final side of queer possibility I wanted to talk about today is fluid character ownership. Often when we play role-playing games or when we kind of engage in any kind of taking in a story, our story is really focused on a hero or a small number of heroes. And we come to experience the world through that hero's journey, right? That hero's struggle, that hero's perspective. And we're really limited to it. I mentioned earlier that fluidity is part of queer experience and queer life. I think the other thing that's important to recognize is that queer people can't survive this world alone. That community is really essential to understanding our lives, our stories, and our experiences. And one of the ways that you can achieve storytelling that is about community is to get rid of the idea that I've got my character, right? I've got my guy. And I can only engage with the world through the lens of and actions of my guy. And when we release that a little bit, and we explore what it's like to share a character, to move between characters. We get to explore what it's like to move between identities and to exist within a relational framework. We get to see how everyone has different strengths that they bring to the table, and it's only through bringing all of those strengths to the table that we can succeed and do whatever it is that we're trying to do. And in Bluebird's Bride, what we're trying to do is figure out what's up with her husband. So who here has played Bluebird's Bride? Amazing. Bluebird's Bride is the story based on the folktale of a young bride who has just been married to Bluebeard, a very powerful, intimidating man. He's a merchant and he owns a castle, probably. And he says, I've got to go away on business, despite the fact that we literally just got married 5 minutes ago. Anyways, here's the keys to my estate. You can just explore, make yourself at home, open any door except the red door at the end of the hall. Whatever you do, don't open the red door at the end of the hall. And then it's a game about how you obviously don't open the red door at the end of the hall ever, right? Why would you do that? It's a story about exploring the estate and coming to slowly realize this man is not a safe man to love. This is not a safe place to be, and I will only truly understand my fate once I've found out what's behind that red door. You don't play as individual characters. You collectively play as the bride, and each of you plays a different aspect of the bride's psyche. And so this is a game that's engaging really intentionally with traditional gender roles. And so you are playing as kind of traditional feminine archetypes housed within this person. One of you is the mother. One of you is the crone. One of you is the witch. One of you is the femme fatale. One of you is the innocent, naive maiden. And your voice is kind of within this person's head, and you are constantly negotiating what happens next and vying for control over the bride's actual body, like what she actually does in the rooms. So it's a lot about her interior dialogue or interior monologue. It's about what impulses moment to moment guide her. And so this is an interesting one, and then it's kind of exploring the community that is the community of conflicting perspectives housed within each of us. And the final game that I wanted to mention is Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast. Who here has played this or owns a copy of it? I believe that at this time, the final print version from the Kickstarter is being distributed. So it's going to be available to buy soon. It's really cool. I encourage you all to check it out. Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast is the story of a bed and breakfast that exists in kind of an ephemeral non-time, an ephemeral non-place. But it's it's the 9th of September and you're in the woods, and it's always the 9th of September. And which woods? Kind of like all of them, the mythic woods. Those woods, yeah, the woods behind your house. And Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast is a place for all of those people who didn't fit into the world to come. And so we have Hey Kid, this little devil imp. We've got, I can't remember everyone's names. They're really cool. They're quirky, and you play out chapters. The idea is that they are kind of, they're chapters from this storybook collection that you vaguely remember from when you were a kid. And there's 50 books, and you can kind of half remember how it goes, or that TV show. You remember that TV show. And so it's kind of a half remembered, beloved, sprawling children's series from yesteryear. And each of these chapters has different characters, and they're all slice of life. You play through a chapter in, on average, an hour is kind of the ideal. And so we just explore different themes and different vibes. And in a lot of ways, it's a cozy game, but it's also a cozy game about characters who are shaped by trauma and hardship and who are running from something. And they might be quirky robots and imp kids and the Prince of the Moon, but also they're kind of relatable, archetypal queer experiences. And what's really cool is that every time that you play a chapter, there's a different cast of characters who show up in the chapter. It's fairly scripted kind of kickoff to every chapter. And so you're always playing a rotating set of characters. And there's a lot of encouragement to not get attached to any one character as yours, to always be mixing it up, playing as different characters, and adding little Post-it notes and notes in the margins and making the character your own, so that these characters are always evolving and growing, and we're seeing what it means for them to change over time and to be kind of indelibly shaped by all of the players who pick up their page. And so we get to explore not only how these people are impacted by the many people who play them, kind of representative of the many people who impact them in their community. But also we get to explore what it's like to experience the world of Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast through multiple lenses and find out ways in which we're kind of a Hey Kid, we're kind of a Sal, we're kind of an Amelia, and how all of these characters kind of live within all of us as well. It's really cool. It's really fun. It's really cute. It also explores intergenerationality within queer community, which is something that I feel like is really missing from a lot of conversations and that is really rare to experience in not just games, but any kind of media. And so I think it does that in a really interesting way. I mentioned that queerness is political and that game mechanics are political, and that it's important to attend to the ways that queer people are or are not represented within games, not just on a kind of a textual or visual representation level, but also on a mechanical representation level, how queer narratives and queer experiences are or are not baked into games. And that's important both because we spend a bunch of time playing games, and also because if game mechanics are political expressions, what we're doing when we play games is we're practicing certain types of political engagement, certain types of ways of engaging with ideas about power and our relationship to it, causality in our relationship to it, change in our relationship to it. Our stories tend to leak out into the real world. One of the things that I really like about role-playing games is that sometimes you're just an elf who can like do cool backflips and has like a really big sword, and you can like teleport between shadows, and it's just that simple. And other times you are learning like what it means to heal and grow, what it means to become vulnerable, what it means to lose a friend. And those can both be like the same role-playing game. And those moments can be like 5 minutes apart. Role-playing games are really good because they're something that is made for us at a table without an audience. They're something that are ephemeral. The stories don't have to make sense in retrospect. They can be incoherent messes because they're about experiencing how we make choices moment to moment and what interesting things happen when we make certain choices. Because of that, they're a really good way to explore what happens when we experiment with the rules of the world. Our stories inevitably tend to leak out into the real world, whether in big ways or small, whether now or 20 years from now. I wanted to end with a quote that was related to that. This is from Auguste Boal, who was the kind of progenitor of theater of the oppressed. And he wrote, in talking about theater, the theater itself is not revolutionary. It is a rehearsal for the revolution. When we play games, we have this brilliant opportunity to find out how the world works and how we can change it. And that's really powerful and cool. Thank you all so much for your time. It's been so wonderful to talk to you all. And we have 15 minutes. Well, we have 14 minutes to have some questions. And I see a hand here and then a hand here.
So when you were talking about Bluebeard's Bride, I can't speak today apparently, and you were talking about how all the players are playing different aspects of a single character, it occurred to me as someone with OSDD and who is an OSDD system, it occurred to me I don't think I've ever seen a game that was so inherently you are all playing a single different aspects of a system. And I was wondering if there are if you can think of any other games that are like that where you're all playing different parts of the same character, because that was fascinating to me and I would like to see more of that.
Yeah, there's one game that was actually put out years before Bluebeard's Bride that comes to mind. I can't remember the name. Does anybody know the game? Everyone is John. Everyone is John. I don't know if it holds up in the same way as Bluebeard's Bride. Bluebeard's Bride, I think, is it's really evocative. It does take those themes and explore gothic horror with them. And so if you don't like the idea of exploring kind of an internal system within this kind of like shocking, gruesome horror thing, it might not be for you. I know that that might be like, that might not jive for some people, but I think if you're down to explore how a system navigates a horrific situation, and a situation that is kind of like psychosexually horrific, Bluebird's Bride is great.
Also on the idea of Bluebeard's Bride, I have it, and I'm very excited about it. I've had it for years, but every time I think about potentially running it, I have a fear that pops up that stops me, which is this perception of, let me, a cisgendered man, tell you about feminist horror. Like, I don't have, I feel like, how does one, if one is not queer, how does one run? But I'm an ally, yes. But I feel like I'm like, yes, let me, run a game for you. And I just like, I feel like I'm a fake if I run that game.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think there's a couple parts to the answer. The first is that if you think this game is super exciting and you have a group of friends who think that game is super exciting, and that group of friends has a number of women in the group, that you should ask them, hey, could I support you in running your first role-playing game? We've talked about how this game seems really cool, and I think you'd be great at running it for these reasons. And don't say, because you're a woman. name the reasons that they'd be good at running a gothic horror game. And say, like, is there any kind of, like, support or, like, co-GMing that would help you feel good running this game? Because I want to get to play in it. And then that's really focusing in on you want your friends to get to run games. You want to get to play games. And it also is kind of recognizing that, like, maybe you're not the person to run this game. That said, I don't think that men should not be thinking about feminine horror. I think men should be thinking about that, and men should be engaging in that, and men should be making blunders in trying to engage in that conversation. Bluebird's Bride has a lot of stuff about domestic abuse. It has a lot of stuff about fears around women's autonomy. Those are conversations that men don't get to excuse themselves from. Okay. And so part of engaging with the world is saying, like, although I'm not the person who can run this from a place of expertise and lived experience, I don't get to opt out of the conversation. It's a cool game. I want to run it. I'm going to find trusted friends who are going to be gentle with me, but also point it out if I make mistakes. And then I'm going to run it. So I think there's a couple ways to go with that. I think that role-playing games are a safe place to get things wrong. So it's
Thank you.
It's not the end of the world. It's just a game. Yeah, I saw Isaac, and then this person here, and then there's a question in the back.
Yeah. Hello. I just have a question regarding queer game mechanics in longer form play, and this might be a mistake because of a sample size issue on my end or my own biases. But from what the examples you provide and from my own experiences, it seems like queer mechanics, as explained here, they're usually in shorter form games or like one-shot or games designed for one-shots. So I'm just curious why you think that may be. Is that just an issue of like society being sorry, that's it. That's my question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think there's a couple answers. One is that the barrier to entry for designing and playtesting a game that only needs 2 sessions to run is lower than the barrier to entry to designing and testing a game that needs, 45 sessions to run to really get the full mechanical progression. And a lot of those games probably aren't play tested for 45 sessions, honestly, anyways, but the barrier to entry for designing shorter form games is lower, and so therefore is easier for people of diverse backgrounds to participate in. I think that's one of the answers. When I think about who do I know who has a stable schedule and life circumstances and a consistent night of the week off for like 4 to 8 months at a time, those are mostly the straight people in my life and not the queer people in my life. So there's another structural factor. And I think also just the games that happen to have been created, that happen to be easy to hack and kind of just stimulating to think about, in this space are shorter form games, often games that work really well with a couple sessions or a short campaign. Apocalypse World is an example of a game that is really easy to hack and create your own kind of layering onto. And so a lot of people, it's just Apocalypse World is fun and it's easy to hack. And so that's what a lot of people thought it'd be fun to hack. So I think it's a mixture of those kind of like incidental and structural factors.
Thank you. Okay, where was I going?
First of all, I just wanted to say, like, straight people are the queerest motherfuckers in the world. So if you think, like, oh, this is just it and this is just existence, then congratulations, you are qualified to go explore yourself a little bit more. And then also, I'm kind of like the opposite. I have no idea about gaming. I showed up and I'm like, I was excluded from those kinds of spaces as a kid because of how it presented at the time. So, but I know a fuck ton about queerness. I got those master's degrees you were talking about. So so I find like Monopoly to be like where I come from when it comes to gaming. Like that's how ignorant I am. Like I find the idea of D&D so overwhelming, and like you were talking about a 50-hour game, I'm like, nah. Like how do I get started with this kind of stuff? Because I'm really intrigued and I love this whole idea of why aren't I a fantasy writer? Why aren't I doing sculpture and all that stuff? Because it's like, wow, this really could engage, and I see this, huge trend coming up with the kids and everything. And I want to relive my youth in that sense of like, fuck you, I'll play D&D. So, any recommendations for that?
Yeah. What city do you live in?
Well, I grew up in Farmington Hills.
So right now,
Right now, I'm in the middle of nowhere in Wixom.
Okay. Is anyone else in this room
No.
from there?
No.
Where's the city that you're close to?
Novi.
Anyone?
Yeah, exactly.
I was hoping I could just like do a matchmaking moment.
This is why I come over here.
No, there was and probably will be again in the future in Novi a convention called SiegeCon, which is tabletop role-playing, including Dungeons and Dragons.
What does that mean?
That means it is a place where first-time game players, long-time game players meet up, and the same way it's going on in the basement here, you can go downstairs, they will introduce you to a variety of tabletop games, run you through the rules, put you through an introductory session with supportive people around you, and hopefully you'll have fun. And you may find this game is not fun. I may like this tabletop role-playing game, and it suits me better. But you are in a massive collection of your people. And
It's a safe space for gaming.
yeah, and living.
How do you spell ZegeCon?
Just siege with a Z at the beginning.
Okay, great.
Z.
So
What about you? Because I was asking you the question.
yeah, no, the reason I took that approach is because I think that the best way to get into games is to find someone who runs games and is looking for more people to play with and to play games with them. And to play whatever they are excited about and then decide after playing it, is that also the game that I'm most excited about, or would I have preferred something more long form, shorter, that had more creative agency, or there was more like less creatively demanding? Did I want, maybe that was sci-fi and I wanted fantasy, or I wanted slice of life, or whatever the case might be. But I think that while I could name like a book to go read and to try and run as a first-time game, Dream Askew. I designed it. It's available on buriedwithoutceremony.com. I think the best answer, honestly, is to find people who live near you, who already like games, and play them. And if those people don't exist because you live in the middle of nowhere, I've been there. I get it. And I think you should try Dream Askew.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and then if you want more of Avery, she will also be on our next panel about world building. So,
Hi. I had a question about your point about game mechanics being political, specifically your point about how power is earned and therefore like any power the character has is valid. And I definitely see that in with the heroes and sort of like the player characters. But I was wondering how that theory may or may not apply to like a villain's power. Like, is a villain's power valid, and how does that interact with power essentially?
Yeah. Right. So you're right. In a lot of traditional fantasy role-playing games, when I said like power is righteously earned, it is self-justifying, the assertion is actually our power is righteously earned and self-justifying. Their power is evil. And that's part of what just self-justifies our power. Right. The monstrous other is integral to supporting that hero myth. I think that it's really interesting to explore games where power is contingent, relational, messy, how claiming power is important if we're going to affect change in the world, but also someone inevitably suffers when we exercise power over others. Like I think exploring power as a much murkier thing, not good or bad, just a thing that exists in the world and that can do harm and that can do good. Is really interesting. And so when I design, like Dream Askew, tries to really explore power within that context. But you're right, traditional fantasy role-playing games, those assertions that I said that they have about power are specific to heroes. There's this other idea that there's an us, which is good, and there's a them, which is bad, and that we should kill them and take their stuff. And those ideas are baked into a lot of Western mythology, and they are stories that we've told for millennia, and they're stories that tacitly support the rise of capitalism, colonialism, and other harmful, destructive forces in the world. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here. You are an amazing audience. I really liked all of these questions. I really liked this conversation. I'm going to linger for the next 10 or so minutes if anyone didn't have a chance to ask their question. And yeah, I just want to thank you all for being here. I hope that you've had a chance to play really cool games today. The vendor hall is amazing. There's lots of cool stuff going on. So yeah, thanks to the Ann Arbor District Library for having me. Thanks all of you for being here. It was lovely.
Thank you.